After months of speculation about his future, word came out today that the Arizona Cardinals have released wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins. Let's talk about why this happened, what the implications are, and what this means moving forward for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, the first question people have is, why didn't the Cardinals trade Hopkins? Well, they have been trying to, but there apparently are some things that prevented that from happening. So let's talk about some of those factors. First, the $19 million salary was prohibitive for any move, and apparently teams figured he would be released, which has happened, or at least is going to happen. We'll talk about that in a minute. It was also pointed out by Kyle Odegaard that most of the teams that have been discussed as suitors were limited in cap space. Yes, teams can make moves to clear up space, but if they already think he might get released, they're less likely to do that, or at least less likely to make a significant offer. And some folks in the media and analysts have been speculating for a while that he would be released. Going back to March, Eric Eager had speculated that Hopkins would be released, and recently Kyle Odegaard also speculated that he would be released. So let's talk about why this happened now. Austin Ford's been trying to trade Hopkins pretty much since the first week he took the job. And when we consider the efforts to trade Hopkins, there are 3 key points in the calendar that matter. The first is the NFL draft. Obviously, this is a key date in terms of if you hope to obtain draft picks for 2023, but there's also some other implications in terms of the interest from other teams. Teams like to have their bigger moves wrapped up by the time the draft ends so they can come out of it with their core roster generally in place. Sure, they'll make a few smaller moves after the draft to fill holes, but the big moves, they like to have those done by the time the draft wraps up. And based on reporting around the league, the Cardinals were holding out for a better deal than was being offered. A better deal which apparently did not materialize. So that brings us to the second key point in the calendar, and that's June 1st. This is a date after which the cap implications for moves like releasing players or trading them are spread out over the next 2 years. If a player is released or traded prior to June 1st, the dead cap all hits in 2023. Though there is an exception that a player released prior to June 1st can be designated as a post-June 1st release so that the dead cap hit can be spread out over 2023 and 2024. Now, it is important to note that this is not available with trades. There is no post-June 1st designation for a trade that happens prior to June 1st. And apparently, the Cardinals were not interested in a post-June 1st trade or release. According to Tom Pelissero, the Cardinals have not designated Hopkins a post-June 1st release. So apparently this was important to the Cardinals, and Kyle Odegaard has tweeted about this, that apparently the Cardinals wanted him off the books for 2024 so they can get a clean reset for the new regime. And there's one more potential wrinkle to this. According to Howard Balzer, no official league transactions can occur until Tuesday, May 30th, 2 days before June 1st. It is possible that a team could come to the table with a last-minute trade in the same way that the Cardinals traded for Rodney Hudson after the Raiders had announced he would be released. So with all this in mind, it makes sense that the Cardinals would announce his release today. With June 1st just around the corner and the Cardinals not wanting to carry any dead cap from a release over into 2024, this appears to be a last-ditch effort to drum up some sort of trade interest before releasing Hopkins next week. Now, one other key date is the 2023 trade deadline. Why not keep Hopkins around and see if an offer comes around at the trade deadline? Well, apparently there's a couple reasons that the Cardinals didn't want to do this. First was, as I just discussed, they do seem to want to get him off the books for 2024. Keeping Hopkins around to the trade deadline would result in cap carryover into 2024. But there are also other considerations besides the cap numbers. It's also likely that despite a bevy of contradicting and confusing social media posts, the relationship had soured between the Cardinals and Hopkins. And if that is the case, keeping him around could be detrimental to the locker room and the organization. Ultimately, it seems like the Cardinals stuck to their guns, tried to get the best deal they could, and it didn't work out. And now they're putting forth a last-ditch effort to try to drum up a trade offer, and if one doesn't materialize, they're going to release him prior to June 1st. Now, a lot of people are saying this was a misplay by the Cardinals, an L for Monty after a draft that many had lauded as a W. And that may be the case. The Cardinals may have overplayed their hand, held out for too much, but it's also possible that a reasonable trade wasn't going to emerge at all. Perhaps the combination of the cap number, the age, and the fact that teams just figured he would be released in the end prevented teams from making any sort of reasonable offer. And one might argue that maybe they should have just taken a 6th round pick or whatever was being offered around the draft time, and perhaps that's the case. But I don't fault them for holding out to try to get a better offer around draft time. In the big picture, a 6th round pick isn't that significant. And if you say, well, why don't they take the 6th round pick now? Well, that offer might not even be on the table at all now that the draft's gone. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but if they weren't getting an offer better than a 6th round pick or something along those lines, I don't fault them for holding out. And if that offer dried up, well, then you live with that. You take that chance, you try to get the better deal, and if it doesn't happen, you move on. So what's next for the Arizona Cardinals? Well, in the big picture, missing out on a trade for Hopkins is not as significant of a factor as people think it is. Monty Ossenfort has already shown a deftness for moving around the draft board and adding draft capital, and he's put this team in an enviable position going into the 2024 draft, at least in terms of draft picks. While more draft capital is good, if the best offer on the table was a day 3 pick or a pick swap, in the big picture, that's not going to make a huge difference. With all the draft capital that the Cardinals have already added for 2024, and the additional draft capital they're likely to acquire on draft day trades next year, the impact of a Hopkins trade was going to be relatively small in comparison. And I don't think keeping Hopkins around would have made sense at this point. Yes, he's a great player, but this team is resetting the roster. The best case scenario is that they're competitive in 2024, but more likely 2025, a point at which he's going to be 32 or 33 years old with a massive cap hit. From a pure roster building perspective, they're better off to move on from Hopkins, build through the draft, and use their cap space to extend their young players that they're currently developing. It's a bitter pill, but I think it's the right move at this point. But if you want something to be optimistic about, check out this video right here where I talk about the player I think is going to be the long-term replacement for DeAndre Hopkins. Also, while you're at it, please be sure to subscribe for more Arizona Cardinals content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.